Hi, fourth grade. We're going to talk about Langston Hughes today. It's April 22nd, Wednesday, and we are going to not only talk about this poem, but talk about how it compares to Walt Whitman and his poem that we looked at Monday. So, your admit slip for today is to tell me what you think, what job was left out of Walt Whitman's America poem. What would you include as something that is a uniquely American job where people could sing about how wonderful America is? So, just like we did with Walt, let's talk about Langston and a little bit about him. He lived between 1902 and 1967. He was a member of the Harlem Renaissance, which is an artistic movement in the 1920s in New York City. It occurred in other places other than New York, but that was kind of its home base. And this was centered on racial pride for Black America. And what he wanted to do, personally within his writing, was capture, oral traditions of Black culture in written form. He wanted to, almost be a historian, but turn it into poetry, if you will. So he worked as a writer. He was a working writer, and he was published in Alan Locke's New Negro anthology, and he was able to support himself as a writer at the time. And he wanted his stanzas to reflect blues music or everyday speech. So, one of the things that we notice in his writing is the musicality. I'm so sorry. The musicality of it, reflecting specifically blues and jazz music, because he wanted that instead of, I talked briefly about how Waltz had kind of a hymnal quality to it. He wanted his to reflect Black culture, and so it reflected blues and jazz music. And many believe that this poem that we're going to look at, I Too, is a response to Walt Whitman and I Hear America Singing. And a lot of people do that, by the way. Like poets like to write poems to poets or in homage to poems that have been written, either because they want to add something to it or they believe that it's a wonderful piece of art and they want to respond to it. So as you go through school, you'll notice that you discover certain things or responses to other things. So why study this poem? We did this with Whitman. Let's talk about why this poem is relevant today. Langston Hughes is very important. You will talk about him after this class. You will probably write a paper on him. He is an American poet who was a unique voice in Black America in the 20th century for many reasons. He went on to do more than this poem. And he's just somebody that's important to read. And so this is going to be our introduction to him. Then also reading this poem as a response to Whitman's I Hear America Singing, it's really defiant. And it's really strong, and it's what he feels America is and how his culture is waiting for the time in the sun. There's nothing meek about this poem. He's like, okay, you may do this, but then we're going to do this later. So, the joke's going to be on you. And it's a wonderful way to see how words can be revolutionary. This was written in 1932, so we get to look at the context about which it was written, and it's the history that we don't have access to. We weren't there, so we get to learn a little bit about what it was like to be a Black man in this was written in 1932, but in that time period. So there's nothing to say that because we're comparing two poems, we have to not like one or the other one. We're just talking about them in comparison and contrast to each other. So we can love this poem and we can love Whitman's poem. He was a fan of Whitman, but because he felt like he was an overlooked member of society, he used his poetry as a means to respond to that feeling of being completely invisible, or just the absolute frustration with racism and overt racism. Horrible things were happening to people, and he was using poetry to write about that. Um, and when Whitman wrote his poem, um, Black people were not free; they were slaves. When this poem was written, Black America was free, but I mean, the Jim Crow laws were happening, and they still were considered, or treated by many people to be second class citizens. And so, you can still coexist in a world where you supposedly have freedoms as other people, but you're not very free. And so this poem is kind of is an insight into that. So let's read the poem and then we will talk about it. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and I eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll sit at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. One second, move my little doohickey here. So, just in case you don't know, ashamed means embarrassed or guilty because of one's actions. So, he's saying that those of us in society who are treating him this way, we're gonna feel bad about what we did, because he's a human being and he's a great human being, and that's what he's trying to say. He's part of America. So, the speaker is a Black American. Theme. We're looking at perseverance here. We're looking at racism. And racism is an ugly word, but it's a real thing. And he's basically saying, if you're going to let me be a part of this world and you're going to let me be a free part of this world, be prepared, because I'm going to stand up one day and this entire culture is going to say, we've had enough, and we're going to be just as amazing. You're going to see how just as amazing we are compared to what you're doing, because we're equal. So it's written in 1932. The form is free verse. We're obviously looking at free verse. And he's calling everybody out. He's calling out Whitman for leaving him out of the poem. He's calling out America and society for not treating Black America like everyone else, not giving them the same opportunities. He's saying that they don't get to participate in the national conversation. They can vote, but there's always things in place at the time that could hinder people. I think poll tax was a thing, and it just wasn't, the way forward wasn't as clear for Black America as it was for white America. And he warns that there's going to be a day when this is not a thing, and that he's not going to be hindered by his race, and he will be accepted for being who he is. And society is going to look back and be like, I was on the wrong side of history. I feel really bad about what happened. The same way people felt bad about slavery. He was like, you're going to feel bad about this too. Like, this is not okay. And he's saying it in an eloquent way and in such a strong way, that you're like, it's very apparent that it's truth, and it's it's moving. So we don't have a strict rhyme or meter here. But our poetic devices, just like Whitman, he's using repetition. He talks about when company comes. He says that twice. Eat in the kitchen. We're bringing the kitchen back up. And I too sing, or I am America. He says that twice. And we talked about how repetition helps bring a point home. Like he is, he's repeating these things because they're important and because it has that musical quality. We hear it again. It's kind of like a knock at the door, or a beat or something, So we have enjambment in here where we talk about eat in the kitchen, then we've got it separated. And even eat in the kitchen when company comes. At kitchen, he cuts that off. And kitchen is important, like we talk about. We read this poem that some of you liked and some of you did not. I am so sorry. Allergies everywhere. Spring is rough on me. When we talked about Joy Harjo's poem, Perhaps This Is Where the World Ends, talking about the kitchen table. The kitchen table is an important thing for various reasons, and that's why I wanted you to read it. He's talking about the importance of being he's like, fine, you send me at the kitchen. The kitchen table is very important. Like, that's where I get my food. That's where we have communion. That's where it's like, you're just, you know, um, getting me trained up for the big game. Like, he's like, you're just sending me to an important place, and eventually I'm going to be the one running this show. Like, it's an important thing that he goes to the kitchen. But so we've got enjambment, and just basically we have the short sentences, and I talked about the blues and jazz. This has more of a cadence of blues music. The word economy, he's used it. This is a small poem, and in essence, these aren't lengthy lines. It's not 14 stanzas long. He says what he says and he gets out of there. And I just talked about it's more like a blues riff, which we know that if anybody's into music, blues is basically the basis of rock and roll. They took rhythm and blues and gave it a electric guitar, and it turned into rock and roll. So it's a really important and very rhythm heavy music. And it's also personal to him because it's Black music. It's Black people created blues music. And so to imitate that in verse was what he was trying to do. He talked about that. He was like, I want to preserve these traditions of my people, like blues music and jazz music, and the way that we talk and the manner of everyday speech. And I want to highlight that and make it poetry for you to read, because it's important and it's beautiful, and look at this great thing. We also get assonance in here. We just talked about that. And that is the vowel sound. They send me to eat in the kitchen. We've got the e, 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 e. And the company comes. We've got the O's, company comes. And then we have alliteration with company comes with the C's, right? So the entire poem is an allusion, which is a reference or a callback to Whitman's poem. It may not be the same style, as far as he may not imitate exactly how Whitman did it, but he has little nuggets in there. And then obviously the subject matter is similar. So what can we assume about Langston Hughes's America? We talked about this with Whitman. What can we assume about Langston's? It's not necessarily a just place for everyone, right? It's not the America that Whitman was talking about was this like free, open, just place. He doesn't feel that way. It's not necessarily, I just said just, and I just said free, those two words. It's not necessarily the way that he sees it. But that doesn't mean he doesn't love it. Doesn't mean that he's not an American. It doesn't mean being frustrated with the place that you live doesn't mean that you don't feel in your heart that you are that, or that you love that. The same way a parent can get upset with a child for doing something wrong, they can scold them and get on to them, and still doesn't mean that they love them any less. It just means that they're getting in trouble and you have to call them out for it. It's essentially the same thing. He wants it to be better. He's using this as a tool for saying, like, I'm here, I'm part of this, I know that this can be better. And that's how he uses poetry. And that's why poetry is such a wonderful vehicle, because you can do that. And you can do it lyrically and beautifully and succinctly, and someone can digest it and be like, this is what I just ate, and this is what this person was trying to tell me. It's like it's a little snack of something epiphany, little epiphany snack, if you will. And you know what an epiphany is? It means when you have that aha moment. That's what poetry is to me. So he's also saying about America is that he does see in the future a seat at the table coming, right? He sees Black Americans having a national voice in this conversation, but they aren't there yet. And he's saying, like, the reason that he's warning people is like, you need to get on the right side of history. You need to see what's coming and just start acting that way now, because you're going to feel really bad when I am, considered the same as everybody else and you didn't support me and my people. I'm saying me, but he's not just talking about himself. He's talking about Black America. So we also can assume that the individuals, and even though this is a personal poem for him, the individuals who feel marginalized, feel angry about this because the poem is a little bit angry, right? But they still enjoy their lives. They're still laughing and eating at the table. They're still getting strong. They still have families, and they're still, you can see injustice and still enjoy your life and try to work to fix it. And that is what is happening in his America. So the big ideas that we have coming away from this poem, freedom, obviously, because that's a theme that runs through Whitman's, but equality within that freedom, perseverance, because that is something very important to what he's talking about, and pride, right? So, hold on. All right, we have a visitor. She's going to sit in my lap while I finish. Hope you guys don't mind. So, how are these poems alike? We're talking about I Hear America Singing and I Too by Langston Hughes. Both men are writing about America, bottom line. Both are free verse. Both poems have a unique style to the poet. And both are very revolutionary in their message. Whitman is talking about the common man, which is not talked about in his time in 1850, while Hughes is highlighting the struggle of Black America, and that is also a unique voice. So they're both doing something very revolutionary. So how are they different? Whitman is talking about walking down the street and hearing a song, the song of the Americans, and in their work. He's not doing the work. He's watching them do the work. Hughes is talking about being one of the singers. He's talking very personally about it. And that's the next point, is this poem is personal for him, whereas that Whitman's is a man off to the side watching, a third person sort of thing, where Hughes is like, I. He's definitely giving us a personal point of view. Whitman is celebrating America and just, it's just a praise poem at that point. But Hughes is shouting out that he's being overlooked. He's asking for people to kind of like reconsider what you're doing, what you're saying, because I'm telling you, you're not paying attention to me. And then Whitman's language is a little bit loftier. It's not that he was necessarily more educated. He's just using, like loftier language. But Hughes is using these very accessible words to convey his frustration. He's giving us just the bare bones of what's going on, and he's not using giant words. And that's fine. He does it in a way that completely tells us what's happening. Whitman's poem is more hymnal. We talked about that, where Hughes is using more blues musicality. And so they have a different sound to them all, together. And then Whitman is using references to physical labor, while Hughes is using references to communion and the kitchen table. And we talked about the importance of that particular place in the home. because of what it represents. So that's just I wanted to take the time to compare two poems, to give you the ability to just have done that. One of the things that I want to accomplish for the fourth grade is going from reading something and writing a summary about it to reading something and taking it apart. Because I think that that's something that you do as an older student, and I want you to start doing it in fourth grade. So the reason that we compared two poems and how they were like or different, and we're not getting like super deep here. This is not the stuff that I mentioned, the surface stuff. But it's important to look at two things and do a comparison and a contrast, um, and just get your brain working like that. So that is why we compared those two poems. So your exit slip is poetry a good place for expressing frustration with something happening in the world? Yes or no? And why do you think so, or why do you think not? Write 3 to 5 sentences, and that can be your exit slip. And this is your works cited. And I don't have your homework listed on here. I always do that, and I don't have it. So check the assignment sheet for that, because I don't have that slide in here. But I hope everyone is doing well, and I will talk to you soon. How so?